Hi, this is John King and Melody Jackson. And Melody's in Los Angeles. I'm in Ajijic, Mexico. And this week we are welcoming Nathan Fatal, who is a brand new, kind of new boy to Los Angeles, California. And Nathan is a political activist and has a charming and actually inspiring kind of story to tell about his critical transition. So, Melody, I want to turn it over to you and let you just have a little dialogue with Nathan.
All right, and please jump in whenever you like, John.
Okay, will do.
Nathan, welcome. We're so happy to have you here today.
Yeah, awesome to be here.
Yeah, I'd love to just, so that our audience knows who you are, just tell us a little bit about your background, particularly in this area of activism, student activism, and that kind of thing, and we'll get right into it.
Sure. So yeah, my career, my vocation is in activism and leadership training. There's some of the activism and leadership itself, but most of what I do focuses on identifying and training the other people doing the leadership and the activism, and true to the kind of work that I've done with John, and that I'm sure you've done with John, and that you've both done in your respective organizations. It's the kind of leadership that creates leaders. It's the kind of activism that builds an environment where anyone at any level of involvement or anyone in any career field can have some role in the political process, can be aware of it, can impact it, and can take more control over their own lives. And that's what it's all about for me, is empowering people to take control of their own lives and to voluntarily work together to solve problems that affect them and their families, communities, areas, society, our country, and what have you.
Well, you're still pretty young, but you've been doing this for a while, right?
Yeah, I've been doing this at least full time. I've been doing this since I would say about 6 years.
Wow. And how did you get started in this? What was that first period where you said, okay, now's the time, I've got to take some action, and you get into this? Because to me, that seems like it takes courage. I know it takes courage a lot of times to do something like that.
Sure. Well, it is a pretty long story, but the essentials are that I think that the kind of upbringing and teachers and influences I had exposed me to being involved in my community and being involved in activism in some way, and in politics even, pretty early on. So it was more natural. I think that one of the first major experiences of that was through the Boy Scouts, which I give a lot of credit to for instilling and developing values, and teaching people things like self-sufficiency, but also about how to be a member of your community, or even your any level of political entity, like your city, your state, your county, or what have you. So that I was exposed to a lot of community service and a lot of projects that some were community focused, some were environmental focused, some were emergency focused in response to like natural disasters. But I think what they all had in common is just showing people that you can do something about what's going on.
So just a quick question. So was there, it sounds like you were raised with that, and it just sort of got instilled in you from an early age just by the environment you were in. Is that true?
I mean, to an extent. I was not raised per se to be politically active. None of my family has ever been politically active or frankly even aware. and that's not an insult. It's the normal, it's the default state.
Yeah,
that-
it's pretty much how a lot of people in our country were for a long time.
Exactly. Yeah. But again, I think that I was given a lot of opportunities, including being in Boy Scouts and martial arts, and in a great schools, that I was exposed to those ideas. And then as far as any things that activated me, I think that around 2007, 2008, I started to watch and pay attention more to the news, and see that there were much bigger problems out there than the stuff that I at the time thought were big problems close to me. I noticed that there was a world, I guess, not just my immediate surroundings.
How old were you then, Nathan?
It would be hard to say how old I was when I first started developing that kind of consciousness, I guess. I know that in 7th grade, I had a teacher that had a huge impact on me, and that I still sometimes talk to about exactly this. But I would say probably around 16, no earlier than 16 is when I started to think of it in political terms of,
Wow.
yeah, of you can get
Let's
people
go back.
involved in
Let's go back to your
politics.
7th grade teacher. Okay.
I'm sorry?
What was it? Let's go back to your 7th grade teacher. What was your teacher's name?
Oh, sure. My teacher's name was Sue Kakidis. She still lives in Massachusetts and is still a great teacher. At the time, she was my social studies teacher. That's Massachusetts speak for civics or social sciences. I don't know what other places call social studies, but like geography, history.
And what lit up when Sue connected with you? You know, your 7th grade. What lit up in you?
Well, I think she was the first one to teach outside of, not in opposition to, but outside of, in addition to the curriculum. She didn't just teach the tests. She didn't just get people to memorize facts, figures, and dates. She challenged people and asked questions and taught people how to ask questions and think. She got people to see the relationship between ideas, between cultures, there are actually a lot of parallels, really uncanny parallels, between her approach to the world, I think, and yours, and the impact that has for people when you show them that not just the world, but people themselves are bigger than you thought.
Was it a
No,
private school or a public school?
It was a public school. I would say that overall, so I've only had a public school education, including college. I went to the University of Massachusetts. And yeah, there were definitely a lot of things lacking, but the teachers like this and a few others everybody was good, but there were a few that were exceptional and were made even more exceptional by the fact that everyone outside of them was just very average. It was a very average education, frankly, except for her and a few other really impactful teachers and mentors.
Yeah, that's really the point, isn't it? And the point of the conversation we're having here today, Nathan, is those places where somebody impacted you or you impacted someone else in order to cause what the phrase that Melody coined was critical transitions. And I was immediately kind of attracted to, oh, wow, now there's something worth talking about, thinking about. When I was in 7th grade, a man, his name was Van, impacted me. And much like you, he was a guy who looked at me and he kind of dipped into my dreams and my aspirations. And he saw that I, had a talent and a burning desire along the way. And he actually ended up being a sponsor and a friend and one of the key people in my life. And I know my sister when I'm engaged in teaching, my sister will often say, "Well, that's Van," because of things that really happened that caused that change in me, set me on fire. Van's job was to set me on fire and then pour gas on me. And I think that's what Sue's, and I think that's what a great teacher is about. Melody, you probably had experiences like that yourself.
Well, I was just thinking, I definitely love a lot of the teachers I've had along the way in grade school, high school, college, and even graduate school. However, I would say that when I was in seventh grade, I was really mostly worried about being cheerleader again. So I was not on that path quite yet. And I'm also, you said it was around 2007 and 8 that you really sort of got involved. That is also when I sort of woke up and said, wait a minute here. And that's when I got involved. I would say that more in the realm of personal consciousness is something that was always of interest to me, but I think it's a whole different thing when you start to have more of a cultural consciousness.
And I apologize, but just to clarify real quick, the 2007 and 2008, I was not in seventh grade in 2007 and 2008. I'm not that young. You didn't say that, but I realized that I might have misconstrued that. That was some years after that first experience of the world. So 2007, 2008. Yeah, I think around that time I was around 16 or 17. And that's when it became not just like an interest in culture, but it took on a little bit more of a political nature. Yeah.
Well, I guess I'm thinking of, especially how things are right now, the political thing is what's in the culture. So, and I wasn't sure about that, but I didn't, thanks for clarifying. Yeah. So going on then, talking about this Students for Liberty. And what was it? It was Students for Liberty. And what was the other thing related to it? You mentioned.
I've worked with a few specific organizations. Currently, I work with Students for Liberty and the Leadership Institute. I've also worked with an organization called, well, in this case, I mean 4. I've worked for these organizations. Also one called Young Americans for Liberty. But they all fall under what I refer to as the Liberty Movement, which is the sum of individuals, organizations, causes that their general theme is more personal freedom and power over your own life, and solving problems voluntarily through education and training and personal and professional development.
So is this, Ben Shapiro has obviously been excluded from a lot of campuses and there are protests, that kind of, is it aligned with some of that movement that he is in, or no?
There's a lot of overlap between conservative and libertarian organizations and movements. I really try to stay nonpartisan and to never make it about one person or one organization, or even just one issue. I think that individual issues are great for getting people's attention, but it's never just one issue. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but yeah, there's definitely a conservative thread and a libertarian thread, and where those overlap. And I think that to an extent, being nonpartisan actually gives me a lot of freedom and flexibility to occasionally disagree with the mainstreams of both of those threads, or to focus on something that hasn't been focused on before. So it works out that it's nonpartisan.
Nathan, I want to reference you to the music form of jazz. Okay. So in jazz, there's something called doing a riff, which is kind of making it up as you go along.
Sure.
And just making sure it's in the right key. And what I'd love to hear is your riff on kind of a little noodle or a little riff in the area of libertarian. I think libertarian is very kind of not so much misunderstood as ununderstood. And it would be, there's people kind of throw it over into a category and don't really get what's philosophically underneath it, what's the deal. And you're a guy who's been working in that area and thinking in that area. You have a degree in political science. So you've actually been engaged in thinking about the distinction of libertarian in your own way. And I'd love to hear your little riff on what that's about. And
Sure.
And if there's anything about it that is that you happen to be passionate about, don't be ashamed to show it, my friend.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And one other thing I just want to put in there as you're speaking on that is there a distinction between libertarian and what you're talking about as liberty? Because you can identify with the Libertarian Party and then there's the liberty. So,
Right.
having that in the mix.
Yeah, I mean, really, they come from liberty and libertarian. The idea is fundamentally the same. So without getting into or tied to or loyal to any parties, because I don't want it to be the monopoly of one party or organization. Liberty is having control and power over your own life, your own mind. It's the ability to experiment with and act on your judgment and be able to make mistakes, to be able to learn from, and to not be prevented from making mistakes, to not be prevented from the things that enrich and strengthen us in life, like challenges and hardship. And being libertarian just means supporting that idea. I really try to never make it about a party. There are people who call themselves libertarian who are in a party called the Libertarian Party, and there are some people who are not. And I think that as a party, they have a lot of the right ideas and are starting to pay more attention to things like organizational culture and strategy and their technology and updating those things, frankly. But that doesn't make it by any means anywhere close to the only vehicle for the idea of liberty. Liberty isn't limited by a party or a border or a time period. It's really something independent of all those things and something that anyone can have. Of course, I recognize that it's harder. It's easy for me to say that in the United States, but I do believe that to an extent, anyone can embrace liberty, and that even in some cases when you don't have political freedom or you don't have all the political freedom you want, it is possible to at least work on yourself and have freedom, have personal and psychological and spiritual freedom. And that without that, the political freedom wouldn't count for much. So it's much more than just a political or partisan idea for me.
Yeah, it's really great that what you're doing is you're distinguishing it away from a political expression. It can go to that, but it isn't. It doesn't fall into a kind of a box called conservative or liberal. It is really the way that I hear you speaking about it. It's thinking for yourself according to some fundamental principles, and I would like to suggest that perhaps those principles are embodied in the Constitution, are embodied in the idea or the notion that we're all created equal and have unalienable rights, such as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that kind of thinking from there, that doesn't necessarily dictate a liberal or a conservative point of view, but it does kind of create a bias towards the notion of where I'm going to be making my choices from is a choice of, does this actually further liberty or not?
Well, and that really feeds into what I was going to mention, that with that idea, it still seems, and this is a little bit of being devil's advocate, that it seems imply that there's a certain position you might take on a given issue, not the thing itself, but when it comes to, let's say you're going to vote on an issue, then it seems that that status of thinking would imply that this is the one which guarantees the most liberty. Would you say that's true?
Are you asking if the way I decide how to vote on something is based on whether it advances or limits liberty?
Well, it sounds like that would be yes, but
Yeah, if that's your question, then yeah, it would be a yes. If and when I vote, and I normally vote, I don't always vote for everything that happens to be on a ballot, because I do think that there are some things that I'm either uninformed about, or that I don't think that I have the right even to. There are some things I see on a ballot in California, for example, that I really don't think people should be voting on.
Like
What's that?
like what?
Like kidney dialysis. There were a lot of things on the ballot that I believe there were 12 ballot initiatives in California this year. And even with the vast amount of information that was being circulated, including by the state, which I do appreciate that they send out information about the pros and cons, at least their perception of the pros and cons. There are just some things that I just don't understand why people who know absolutely nothing about a particular field or the consequences of a certain set of policies. And I'm honest about that. I'm honest about my limits. I don't pretend to know how that field works. I think that we should leave it up to people who are most familiar with their certain field as to how it works. I think that to the extent that there are regulations to prevent abuse or unaccountability or fraud, those regulations should be made with the say, the input, and the participation of people who are very well versed in that field and understand the consequences and aren't just doing things based on their good intentions. So yeah, but as far as how I vote, I vote along the principle of does this enhance people's ability to pursue what makes them happy? Does this give people more autonomy and power over their own lives? Or does it not? Does it limit their power over their own lives? Does it make criminals out of people who are doing something that doesn't hurt anybody else? That it's a basic principle, and because I'm really clear on that principle, it makes it, once I actually get to read about a policy or a candidate and what they're about, it's pretty easy to make up my mind about that, because I recognize I recognize whether someone or a policy is for or against that idea of liberty and that idea of the personal power to make those decisions for yourself.
So given that that's the case, and given that you're grounded in certain principles I'm wondering, because I actually hear a lot of rhetoric in the general discourse, and the rhetoric seems to be somehow either confusing or entangling or commingling, or maybe they're the same thing, the notion of liberty and the notion of freedom. Could you distinguish that for us, Nathan, as you see it? Are they distinct? Are they synonyms? How do we think about that?
The distinction of liberty and freedom?
Yes.
You know, it's a good question. I've never heard a clear distinction as to if there is a distinction. I don't see there being a difference between the two. there's a difference of positive versus negative freedom, but you can say the same term, positive versus negative liberty. And all that means is positive freedom or liberty is freedom to do blank, freedom to start a business, to eat or consume certain things, to travel to certain places, etc. Freedom from, negative freedom or liberty is freedom from. So freedom from hunger, disease, poverty, fear, discomfort, things like that.
Okay. So that's great, and thank you for that. And then just to kind of push it a little bit further, could you somehow tease out the idea of duty as in relationship to freedom or liberty?
I'm not sure I can with regards to duty. Duty is just not really in my lexicon, because I don't really approach anything as what do I have to do, as if it comes from this immutable thing that's hoisted on me. I don't approach duty in that way. I do believe in responsibility, and that responsible.
Then say something. Yes. Then say something rather than duty.
Mm-hmm.
Say something about the relationship of responsibility to liberty or freedom.
Sure. And before I say that, just to finish the previous thought about the distinction of freedom and liberty, because I don't see a distinction, I never say, and I hear a lot of people say this, but I never say liberties, plural, or freedoms, plural, or freedom and liberty, or freedoms and liberties, because it's redundant. It's just one thing. It's liberty, it's freedom, it's all encompassing. And if you say one, as far as I'm concerned, you don't have to say the other, because if you have that principle, then it's not a list. Liberty is not a list of things that you can do, and as the times change, the list expands, or as people, as education changes, people realize that they have more rights. All of that is just an extension of that general concept of you own your life. You should be able to do the things that pursue your happiness. If you don't prevent someone else from doing so, you should have as much power over your life as possible. Maybe there should be some support structures to ensure that people get to that point and that they can take it from there. But no one should have control over you. No one should be able. I don't believe in someone's right to order me to do something unless I explicitly, voluntarily consent to that, such as if I were to join the military or a police force, or I'm in a work environment and I have a superior, then I'll take orders. But that's voluntary. As far as your more recent question, can you remind me what it was? I'm sorry.
It had to do with responsibility and relationship to responsibility to freedom. And by the way, I love what you're saying about no freedoms, or that idea of attaching some sort of descriptive adjective. It's kind of like, for example, the notion of love. And that, and then people, it becomes unconditional love. And you're going, well, really? So therefore, now we brought up conditional love. Now we brought up stuff that is not love, really, by definition. And I like that. That's how I see love, and that's how you see freedom. And I think I'm going to take that on.
Sure. As far as responsibility, so I would definitely say my sense of responsibility was definitely shaped again by the Boy Scouts, but also by, I think, my cultural upbringing too. My family comes from Portugal, and there's very much this sense of you got to figure it out. Like you got to figure out your own stuff. It doesn't mean you can't mess up. It doesn't mean that you can't ask for help or accept help, but you got to figure out your own stuff. And that they're a very independently minded and pragmatic people. I think their politics don't always reflect that. But if you actually get to know really anyone from that country, they're really interesting, dynamic, hardworking, and hard-thinking people. Another influence was much more recent. I think her name is pronounced Tara Brach. She does a podcast on essentially Buddhism, and she was breaking down the concept of responsibility, and it's the ability to respond to what's in front of you. So responding to the fact that I need food to survive, responding to the fact that I need to have my finances in order to survive and flourish, that I have to respond to that reality, that someone else responding, I'll accept or ask for help, but that I have to be the first responder when it comes to myself and my survival and my well-being and flourishing. So that I don't want to make it too in the clouds, but
look at it this way. This is my point of view, but it is my point of view that there are certain guaranteed rights, for example, that are being abridged.
Sure.
And being chipped away at, and chief among them, one of the first among them is the First Amendment right to freedom of speech.
Yeah.
And how freedom of speech is being censored and curtailed and suppressed in the, quote, land of the free.
Yeah.
And so standing in freedom, what is my responsibility to deal with, to respond to that which is there right in front of me in the realm of against the so-called right of freedom of speech and the so-called reality of I'm being censored or curtailed?
Yeah.
How do I respond to that?
Well, I do think I would put it in a conditional way, maybe, of if you value that right, then I think you have a responsibility to stand up for it, because you don't get to just have it without everyone else having it. And part of that responsibility is accepting that in order for you to have it, everyone else has to have it. And some of those everyone else are going to disagree. They're going to challenge you. They're going to make you uncomfortable. They might even be factually wrong in some cases, but they have that freedom as just as much as you do. I would say that for people who don't value or understand it, I do think that that's ultimately an individual choice or even responsibility of whether or not you value that. But I'm not going to. I always focus on people who are open to learning first, and then if I can get to the people who are completely closed and don't have absolutely no idea about the First Amendment or how it works or how it impacts them, if I can get to them and help them and support them, great. But my quote unquote target or my audience, it's never the people who are already in the choir or quote unquote on my side and completely agree with me. And it's never the people who are completely against me and just their reflex is going to just be to be against me and I'm wrong. Again, I'm open to working with both, but my main focus tends to be the people who I do think are the average, the people who don't know, who aren't well equipped on that topic, and who it's not necessarily their fault. I mean, our American education, I think, has really faltered, and it's trained people to think of history and philosophy as these warm and fuzzy ideas that sound nice but have nothing to do with your life right now, or a list of dates that you needed to pass the test. And a lot of people, that's all that they got out of their quote unquote education, is they remember a few dates. But you ask them about the significance of those dates or what led to the events of those dates, total blank out.
Yeah. And like, why are those the things that we're remembering? Yeah. Something that I'm interested in your input on is how this ties in with capitalism. And is capitalism a place that you're more likely to have freedom. I mean,
Absolutely.
okay, so can you
Yeah.
say a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, capitalism is fundamentally it's the free exchange of goods and services, and it's being able to trade capital, or you could trade stuff that isn't technically money, but the ability to trade value for value in order to increase total value, and it comes with a certain amount of trust in, and also an understanding of human nature, that we need the ability to make some mistakes. We need the ability to do things that sometimes go against the norm. We need the ability to explore. It's in our nature that we explore, we grow, we pursue things that are in our self-interest, and we should continue to do that, provided that we don't actively violate the self-interest of others. So I think that capitalism, it's not only compatible, but it's completely necessary.
That was my next question. Is it necessary?
At least in the context of a mass society where we have governments and we have economies. I do believe firmly that capitalism is the only one of those that allows for this to happen. That being said, if people, part of capitalism is the freedom of association and the freedom of commerce, or the freedom to not engage in association or commerce with people. And that means being able to freely move about and to form communities and groups that are all in on a certain concept or a shared value. So if everybody in a group wants to live a certain way and they're not trying to force that on anyone else, then I'm all for it. People should be able to live absolutely any way that they want and to be able to call it whatever they want. But because of the current structures and system we live in, where I'm not saying I'm against any of these things. I'm just pointing out reality, that we have countries, we have governments, we have borders, we have economies, and the natural tendency of countries, states, governments is to grow, is to expand, is to take on more than it originally was set to do. And out of all the political and economic systems that have ever been tried, capitalism comes the closest and has done the best. And maybe there could be improvements. I also don't think it has been fully done. But I would say overall, it has done the best. It's done the most. It has lifted people out of poverty. It's increased the quality of life. It has extended human life. It has made it possible for us to look beyond Earth, to live in other places and to extract resources from other places. We would not have gotten any of those things if everybody on Earth was completely dominated by government and completely dominated by someone, like a small minority of powerful people with guns, dominating the majority of people who are, the ruled class, the ruling and the ruled.
John, is this who you said that you would vote for president?
I said, I wish he was 35.
You're old enough. Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
you
can count that out. I have no interest in running for that, and I also purposefully made it illegal for myself to run for president. I became a citizen of Portugal and the European Union this year, so I would not be able to run for president if I wanted to, even though I was born in the United States.
Well, we can still put it out there,
Yeah. You can write me in, but I'm not going to accept the role.
Well, the deal is that good people know good people, and so I want to kind of bring in. I spent quite a bit of my time in Central Asia and specifically in Uzbekistan, and I'm currently doing a training with the people who are kind of train the trainers for the Bank of Uzbekistan, which has about 40,000 employees, but I have about 200 people in this leadership program. And it is interesting, given that Uzbekistan is a former Soviet client state, and of all the Soviet client states, and I mean all of them, it was the one that was most wound into it. It was the one that was most controllable by Moscow.
I see.
So we're dealing with the bank, which is essentially exactly the same as the Bank of Russia.
Mhm.
There is a point of view, and as a matter of fact, many of the people that are in the particular conversation that we're having have MBAs, or they have doctorates in finance or economics. Of course, it's Soviet economics. And they are just beginning to wake up to the kind of smell the roses, smell the freedom that is available in kind of thinking from a capitalistic point of view. So there's a lot of startup energy that's going on. They have very access to very few resources because it's still a very strong centralized government.
Sure.
Very strong centralized bank. So I find that the way that my way in with them is to have them enrich their relationships and their conversations with their family and their friends, and then transition from that conversation into work.
Yeah.
Interesting. Wow.
We're learning
What a great idea.
Oh, it's an incredible project. And what's happening is you are seeing people who started out just absolutely guarded and covered and very much afraid to say anything because it's all being recorded and so like that, to where they get to talk about their relationship with their parents and their grandparents, their children and their grandchildren, the people that are in their things, the things that they care about. And this week, last night, I set them into an inquiry on the question of what is the nature of your dream? And they are to share that with their family and talk with their children and to talk with their peers and their sibs while they are developing something called triads. So I cannot wait to see what comes back in the sharing because they are lighting up, they are alive, and they are, underneath all of this great central suppression where there's an enormous amount of fear still.
Yeah.
And where you don't dare broach any particular subjects. My partner over there has said, we can't talk about this, we can't talk about that. And it's a few things. But on the other hand, I've been working there for 10 years, so I'm pretty clear about what you can talk about and not talk about.
Yeah.
But what we're beginning to introduce, Nathan, is the notion of freedom and the notion of personal freedom and the notion that you actually have the right to make your choices. And it's not necessarily in the face of the government when you're making choices regarding your relationships with your wife and your children or your parents or your grandparents, or creating a startup. And as bankers, what we've tried on is the notion that what you're actually in is the relationship business. This is a whole new idea to them. You're actually in the relationship business, and you have been provided with this enormously powerful vehicle called banking to practice relationships. And it starts with each other. So what we're doing is we are creating a monumental, great step forward, if you will say, into what we call stage 4, where people are going into partnership with one another rather than living in a relationship where they are suspicious of and afraid of what their neighbor's going to say and that their neighbor's going to turn them in.
Yeah.
Okay, now.
I love that.
That's what's happening in Tashkent, Uzbekistan. What's happening in Portland, Oregon is if you have too many people for turkey dinner, your neighbor calls up and reports you.
Oh, and you're not allowed to sing.
Oh, you're not allowed to sing. You're not allowed to come together and go to church, for example. Practice freedom of religion. So very interesting that what's going on in the Soviet client state stronghold of Uzbekistan is a freeing up and an expression of freedom and liberty. And what's happening on the west coast of the United States and on the east coast as well of the United States is a closing down and a suppression of your First Amendment rights, of your threatening of your Second Amendment, of all of the Bill of Rights,
Yep.
and so on. And it literally is to people who are Russians. I don't know if you follow a guy who blogs named Lex Friedman, F-R-I-D-M-A-N, Lex Friedman, well worth following. A Russian who lives here. He works on artificial intelligence. He's at MIT, and he talks about how Russia is becoming the United States and the United States is becoming Russia.
Okay.
You know, I think this is a really good place to kind of transition into the next piece of our conversation, because you're both talking about impact, leadership, how to make that difference. And that's sort of in the, you know, it's in the air about what we're talking about. So turning to what you're doing with the young people, the college students, the groups, the younger people that you're bringing this education influence, what would you say the status of the people that you work with? What's the status with them in terms of how they're thinking about this kind of thing, how they're thinking about freedom? And
Yeah.
how are you making an impact or trying to make inroads there?
Sure. I think that the status of the liberty movement and the people who are a part of it, the overall trend or direction is it's getting better, better organized, bigger, more widespread, accomplishing bigger victories, and some of the more measurable, just to be more specific and measurable, that includes people running for office and in some cases getting elected who are truly accountable to their constituents and who are truly accountable to the idea of limited government and individual rights. It includes changing policies at whether it's public colleges or in government, from the city level up to the national level, that are also in line with those principles. And we've seen that schools have changed their policies to be, in some cases, to be more restrictive of free speech, but there have been a lot of examples the last few years of them being more protective of free speech. Of the general trend is that we're not going to keep locking people up for victimless crimes. The general trend seems to be that there's less warfare than there has been in a long time, and that there will, in general, continue to be less warfare. The general trend, I don't want to get too off track, because I'm not saying that those are necessarily accomplishments of the liberty movement. If we're talking specifically about the liberty movement and the people I work with, I would more narrowly focus it on, again, people getting elected, enacting good policies, and changing policies from those university to the legislative level. I framed it as in general because I do think that this year is an exception.
And I was speaking in general, like, what do you see among students and young people across the board in the bigger picture, as well as specifically for what you guys are doing?
Well, I do think that this year has posed a lot of challenges to that. The fact that in many, many places there is no in-person class, so it's hard to organize a college campus. The attacks on the freedom of speech and assembly and many other things have really, really ramped up. I've never seen a more rapid escalation of government power over people's lives, and it's totally reckless and without any regards to the impacts. It's all about good intentions and pretending that, you know, we can have this world where disease vanishes and that we can have this perfect setup where we don't make any mistakes anymore. and that anything that happens in the meantime is just collateral damage. You know, you have to break some eggs to make an omelet. Anyway, so I bring up the challenges of 2020 and of COVID and the reactions to COVID because it's posed challenges directly to activists and to the liberty movement, and some of which I think they've done a really good job of, and some of which we haven't quite figured out what to do about. One of the areas of what we've done a good job of, including specifically in Students for Liberty, is not being limited by geography and having many more events, online events, of course, that are educational and training. So we don't know, it's not in our control. So I've been thinking a lot about the serenity prayer, you know, knowing the difference between what you can and cannot control, right? And there are things that are not within our control. We don't know if or when COVID will ever go away. We don't know how it will go away. We don't know on what time frame. We don't know when lockdowns and curfews will end and school will be back in session. But we know that the internet still works. We know that people still have that there are still many people who want to learn and want to act, for that matter. So there have been a lot more events with a lot more people attending them, and I think that has in some ways widened the funnel. If you think of activism as one of the goals of activism is to get more people active, then activism is kind of like a funnel where the input of the funnel is people who are not involved yet, and the output of the funnel is people who stay involved. So I'm always thinking of how can we expand the funnel to get more people into the process. They don't have to take a blood oath to some cause or organization. They don't have to dedicate their whole lives to it. They don't have to make it their career. They don't have to do anything that they don't want to do. But how can we make it possible for them to do that? So that's been the positive of this year, is getting people to think creatively, entrepreneurially, and without the traditional limitations of geography or time zones or having an office building or a campus to focus operations on.
And how do you reach these people?
Which people?
Well, new people that you're trying to speak to.
Relationships. As John pointed out, it's all about relationships. I mean, one person who takes on their ability to communicate and to be a leader can now reach into new networks that no one else has reached into yet. So I'll give you a quick example that, to my knowledge, this is the first year that Students for Liberty has a presence, any members whatsoever or leaders, in a country called Guinea-Bissau. Guinea-Bissau. It's a little tiny country in Western Africa, on the west coast of Africa. It's a Portuguese-speaking country that very, very few people know it even exists. And there are leaders there now, and they have a group chat on WhatsApp, and they host webinars, and every webinar they host, there are more people on them. So at one point, a student, one of our regional leaders in Africa for Students for Liberty, who oversees a group of countries, reached out to me and said, "Hey, we have this new group. We'd love for you to give a talk for them." And I said, "Well, why don't we have people from every Portuguese-speaking country that we have members in on this webinar, so they can all meet each other and learn from each other?" Because we already have English speakers already had that. We have a very wide world and wide network that it's not a novelty to us anymore. Like we're surrounded by like-minded people, but they are not. So we put on a webinar that was originally just supposed to be me talking to these students in Guinea-Bissau, but instead it was our leaders, our top leaders in Brazil and in Portugal, speaking to these students and then immediately offering them resources. And what came out of that was now Brazil and Guinea-Bissau, they now have a mentorship program that they set it up completely on their own. There was no guidance, there was no push, there was no request for it to happen. They apparently didn't need any money to do it. It just happened. And now they just communicate regularly. And then they started inviting people that they knew from other countries. There are a total of 8 Portuguese speaking countries in the world. And first we had a presence in 1, and then 2, and then 3, and now like I think 6, and they all communicate with each other. Not every student in every country, but there's communication between students and leaders in all of these countries.
Wow, that
That would
is
be an example.
that is very, very exciting. And
I think
yeah,
so.
oh yeah, that's just like wow. And then let's say, so then in the United States, you're reaching out to students. It's just by relationships and just sort of that this one tells one and that one tells 2 and goes to that network and that kind of thing.
Sometimes, sometimes it's people are already involved in some organization or cause where there's overlap. Sometimes it's people meet each other at an event, and that is a big function of the in-person events when they do still happen, is people meeting each other and working together.
Yeah, that is one of the limitations of the online situation. You don't have those sort of spontaneous conversations like you would in person.
The main limitation of doing most things online is the lack of in-person recruitment. And in-person recruitment is very literal and very direct. It's you approach strangers and you ask them to join. You don't just flat out say, hey, you have a pulse. Do you want to join my group and take on a leadership role that I'm not going to define right now? But it is looking for, you know, where do we share some values? What issues are important to you? Okay, great. Here's what you can do about it. There's actually more than you thought you could do about it. Okay. And now here's how that issue connects to all these other issues and to this broader view or philosophy. So people get introduced through individual issues or their individual passion for a particular topic. And through that, they are introduced to a broader worldview, I guess you could say.
Well, you're creating, you're creating a group movement. You know, when you put all of your Portuguese speaking countries together, you've created a group movement, and you've done it digitally. But I guess the dream, and what is the nature of the dream, is that we could meet together in person someday, because ultimately you want to do a group hug. You want people in the group to actually be touching and interacting with individually. This is the way humans are designed. Humans are designed to be ultra social, and that we are not. We're doing a workaround. And everything that's going on right now, including these massive webinars with hundreds and hundreds of people, these classes that I'm doing, and so on like that, still the thing that's missing is the group hug, the thing that happens. I think what a leader is really an activist for, is they're really trying to, okay, what's the nature of your dream? Let's get together and have a hug and talk about it. And trying forward. That's sort of the notion. Yeah, really. Yeah. But it's so extraordinary to hear this story about this little, unknown, brand new country in Western Africa, and how they're being supported, given that the rest of the world literally does not know about them.
Right. Well, actually, quick side note. Sorry, quick side note.
That it was all spontaneous that happened as well, that it just sort of evolved out of the moment.
It was pretty spontaneous. And just to add to one of your points real quick, John, it's funny you mentioned brand new country, because it's brand new in the sense that it just joined our network, but it's also brand new in the sense that it's only been an independent country since about 1974 at the very earliest. It might have been 75 or 76, but yeah, it is a pretty new country too.
So sorry, I forgot to turn my phone off, but I got one more question for you.
No worries,
Okay.
I'm here.
Okay.
So yeah, that has been one of the highlights of the year, and an example of not being limited by borders and your typical constraints.
Yeah, it takes it out of the parochial conversation. You know, as an American, one of the kind of raps on being an American is that unless you've been somewhere, done something, lived somewhere else, pretty much you have a parochial and an American point of view, which is not a bad thing. It's just parochial and relative to the rest of the world. I know that when I began working in the Middle East and in Central Asia and in Southeast Asia, it was an eye opener, and people were speaking languages that I'd never heard. They were from countries that I had never heard of, and now they're in parliament and they're making a difference. And so I see that what you're doing is that. And while it did come together as a kind of a spontaneous action, getting all of these Portuguese speaking countries together on a call, all of the preliminary work had to have been done. And it had to have occurred to someone, I'd say Nathan Fatal, had to occur to someone that, oh, maybe we should all get together and talk in lieu of our group hug. And then maybe someday we can meet in West Africa and talk. I think this has something to do with being Portuguese, for one thing, by the way, just so you know. I am a great fan and admirer of Vasco da Gama, and who is one of the great discoverers and adventurers of all time.
Yeah.
In the golden age of Portugal. And he did what has been said, play the game, learn the rules, correct, which is the essence of leadership. Play the game, learn the rules, correct. So rather than knowing the rules in advance and then playing the game to perfection, which is what we often are educated to try and do, in fact, it has us be a lot more spontaneous, a lot more like doing our life as a jazz riff, doing our life as a work of art, and correcting as we go. And Portuguese, in my mind, happen to have a huge and great and noble history of doing that.
Yeah, that's great. Before we wrap up, we're almost at that point. We'll be wrapping up. I'd like to ask you just one more question and kind of go full circle back to this whole idea of transitions and challenges. So what would you say is the biggest challenge you've already faced, and what's the current challenge you're looking at and taking on?
Could you rein that in a little bit more? Challenge in
the realm of
life, or this year, or what?
Oh yeah, in the realm of, besides this year, in the realm of what you're up to and what you're creating around the Students for Liberty and the Liberty movement.
Well, one of the big challenges that comes to mind is people's cynicism. And people's people being limited by their beliefs and by their experiences and by what they make their experiences mean. And there are many people in this movement, and I think that they're all, or at least the vast majority of them, are good people. But there are a lot of people who really see themselves as victims of the current political situation, or who
you mean within your movement? Yeah,
there are people who are, to borrow some language from tribal leadership, which if any of your listeners haven't read, they absolutely should. There's this idea of a stage 2 culture where people are disconnected, and they feel like just they got the short end of the stick. Something's not working out for them. It might be working out for other people, but their life kind of sucks, and they're a victim of circumstances. And I hear that so much, that mentality, that language, from people in the liberty movement. And it really, really comes out when we try to do something big or try to do something challenging, or that shakes them up or pushes them beyond their comfort zone. So it's been hard, for example, to introduce personal and professional development into the mix when this is a relatively young movement, and the focus has mostly been on intellectual ideas and on informational learning. And if you have enough information, then you can construct a logical enough argument. And if you can do that, you can win an argument. And if you just win the arguments, then you win the battle. And if you win the battle, you win the war. And a lot of it is just very, very in the clouds and not down to earth, or at least not as much as I'd like to see it. And yeah, it manifests itself as cynicism of, you introduce them to a person or to an idea or opportunity, and the gut reaction is to not do it, or there must be some kind of catch, that kind of thing. It manifests itself as factionalism, even as people dividing themselves into, frankly, I think, really unnecessary factions that magnify the things that they don't have in common and distract from all the things that they do. It manifests itself as there are a lot of people who are genuinely confused about what they can and cannot control. And they run around pretending that they can control certain things that they can't. For example, they run around pretending that you can make someone agree with you if you just argue at them enough. And if you just make a list for them of all the Latin terms, of all the logical fallacies that they've made, eventually you'll get to them. Or if you correct them, if you belittle them enough, it'll work. And then they also run around.
That's pretty funny, Nathan.
Yeah. And then they also run around pretending not to be able to change or control some things that they can change. So the example with that is when people say stuff like, I tried to get someone involved, but they weren't interested, as if being interested is this static condition. And if someone doesn't just throw their interest at you and say, I'm interested, I'm going to line up and do whatever you tell me to. Do you want to give me a knife so I can slash my hand and make a blood oath to you to make it work? And that if that doesn't happen, then it's like, oh, they must not be interested.
Well, there's so much black and white thinking. I mean, that's what you're really referencing.
Well, it's dualistic. It's dualistic. It's if they don't do exactly what I want them to do, or agree exactly with me or whatever else, they're not good enough for it. And another example of that is geography or political culture. I can't tell you how many times people have said something like, California is a lost cause, or why are you bothering, or when I moved here a few months ago, more people said my condolences than congratulations. And it's like, I didn't ask for someone's pity. I chose to come to California. It's actually kind of insulting when people say my condolences, even if they're joking, because I came here because I believe in people. And because I do think that California sets the cultural tone for the rest of the country, which sets the tone for the rest of the world. As California goes, so goes America, so goes the world.
Well, I've thought sometimes when people say, well, why don't you leave? And I have thought about leaving. But at the same time, I think, well, no, I'm going to stay here and hold my space for the beliefs that I have. There are a lot of things that I love about California, completely independent of politics and all of that. And it's like someone's got to hold the fort down and be a stake over here, even if the rest of the tent is sort of flapping around in the wind. It's like somebody's got to be here and fight. But I do understand what you're saying. And even for people who are in whether they're conservatives or people who believe in liberty and support that idea, they will say the same kind of thing. It's like they just talk about people who live in California and who stay here, so I do hear you on that. Yeah, it's a very,
So Nathan, just to kind of wrap up here, I want to give you a little moment to do again your jazz riff on, and I would like to ask you to sort of address what is the nature of your dream.
Sure, I can try. Well, I think the nature of my dream is people knowing the power that they have and how to use it. That a lot of the problems we have are not immutable problems. They come from misunderstanding. They come from a lack of communication and a lack of connection. And that while it might not be the ideal vehicle, and it many times doesn't go the way we want it to, I do think that politics and activism are a vehicle to accomplish those things, and that it might be a faster vehicle than some of the other ones available.
such as,
Certainly more public. Well, such as culture. I absolutely do think that politics is downstream from culture, and that culture shapes policy, and we see that every day. But at the same time, while I do believe that what I'm doing will have a long-term benefit, I do selfishly want to have some kind of instant or near-term gratification. I do want to see some of the results. I want to see some results of my action, and therefore I want to focus on things that I know are within my power to shape or affect or change, and get clear on how to measure those successes or failures and how to improve, and train other people to do the same. And one of the examples of that is getting people to see that the higher level of politics you're talking about, whether it's a campaign or an elected office, say the president, the less it actually affects you on an everyday basis, and the less control you have over it. It doesn't mean that you're not a part of it, but the lower level it is and the closer it is to you, the more effect it has on you. Now, the corollary of that is the higher level of something that you volunteer for or get involved with, at least if it's in a non-integrated, disorganized way, the less impact you have. Whereas the more focused you are on specifics, and you can change the specifics as you see fit, you can focus on different things at different times. But the more focused you are on things close to home, in your backyard, in your community, whether it's a campaign or a currently elected official or a policy or an issue, the more you focus on those things and get clear on it, then the more of an effect you have. So part of my goal for next year, for all the training lined up for next year, leadership and activism training, is to help people see their role at a local level and show them how valuable it is to volunteer and be involved locally, as opposed to like a very shallow, not useless, not without value, but a very shallow and kind of flash in the pan kind of involvement that a lot of people start with at a national level.
Yeah. Adopt a Highway actually trumps world peace.
I'm sorry?
I said Adopt a Highway. You know, you're in LA, and it's a kind of probably new to you, but you drive along the 405 and the 101.
We have those.
Yeah, I've seen Adopt a Highway.
Right, he's new.
I'll say this highway's been adopted by Bette Midler or something like that. Adopt a Highway, which is a great way to activate on a personal level. And that person is more effective than these people who say, I'm all about world peace.
Yeah, great. Before we wrap up, Nathan, where can people find out more about you and your organizations and the things that you're taking care of here? And
Sure. Well, I personally am on LinkedIn. My name is Nathan Fatal. My last name is easy because it's spelled like fatal. So I'm on LinkedIn. So that's where you can see stuff about me. I don't have a personal website or anything like that. With regards to the specific organizations, there's studentsforliberty.org, and it's all spelled out, no spaces or anything. And Students for Liberty has, while based in the United States, it does have a global focus. And then there's a Leadership Institute, which is leadershipinstitute.org. And that is also based in the United States and does do some trainings abroad. And we do have actually locations now in the US, Peru, and Chile, but much more focused on the US. And all of the trainings, everything that's coming up is all listed there. There are many, many training offerings, pretty much anything you can imagine that would help people be better equipped to be a leader or activist. We either have or are developing trainings for, mostly online right now, but outside of this year, there are generally tons of in-person offerings as well.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, my pleasure. Well, it was a lot of fun and a refreshing conversation, mostly because of the quality of the questions. You know, I hear a lot of low quality questions being asked in everyday life. So it's nice to be in an environment where we can ask high quality questions and go beyond what's common or comfortable.
Yeah, very
Okay,
exciting.
thank you. Yeah, and thank you again, Nathan, and hope to see you again here for the update about how you're changing the world.
Absolutely. Take care.
All right.
Okay,
Thanks.
bye-bye.
Bye-bye.